Medicare?
They haven't.
Because again, even as a liberal paper as the New York Times has come out and said something's got to change in Medicare. It can't continue the way it is.
No, they haven't. They haven't passed a budget for several years, and they don't appear to this year either.
Okay. So when people start talking about Medicare, they're talking about apples and no oranges.
Well, what you really ideally want to do is have the House pass a budget, the Senate passes a budget, and then you find some sort of compromise in between. Well, what we're now is sort of outside the congressional process, and you have a select group meeting with the vice president. It's going to be, again, a top-down. What you really want is something that's been through committee, that's been voted on in committee, that's been vetted in committee, so we have some idea where we're going. We're going to be presented with something out of the vice president's group, I hope, but we're not going to have much time to look at it before we have to vote on it. That's not really the way the founders intended our government to work. They wanted to have it much more open and transparent, have citizens have an opportunity to affect the final outcome. Even being where I am, I can't really affect what's happening there because it's not going through any sort of regular order or process.
And would it at some point go back through the committees, even after the negotiations with Biden? So Biden is virtually circumventing the Congress?
Well, it might, but I worry it's going to be so close to this August 2nd date that they're not going to have time to bring it back through the committees, and we'll have to just vote on it on the floor. In theory, yes, it could come back to the committees, but I don't know if it will.
Okay. So it might be one of those things, kind of like the health care bill, where you get it, you have to vote on it right away, and you don't even know what's in it?
Well, that's my concern, because it's not really going through a regular process. And again, it's tough to get this group to come together, and so I think they'll use all the time they have allocated to them, which I think is about mid-July.
Okay, and compared to two of the three items that you said were kind of like mandatory, defense, or Social Security, Medicare, and what was the other one? Is that
Social Security, the entitlements?
Social Security, yeah, the entitlements. Is defense on that?
Well, defense is what we call discretionary spending. We vote on it every year, and I think you're going to see, at least in terms of some reduction in the defense budget as well. The Secretary of Defense is recommending that as well, so I think you're going to see some reduction there too.
Okay. Now, Medicare compared to Social Security, is Social Security less of a problem right now, or is it something that do you see any action on that this year, or is it?
Well, Medicare is going broke in 2024, and it's 5 years earlier than was projected. Social Security is 2036, so we have a little more time with Social Security. But again, it is something that we should be dealing with now. Putting these problems off until the very last minute isn't helpful. We have time to manage it now. But Medicare, I think, is in a more critical place than Social Security.
Okay. So you expect some movement on Medicare this year, somewhere along the line, but...
Well, I'm hopeful for the country that we have some movement on it, and I think it's going to be essential in order to get this debt under control. You're going to have to deal with it. And even the president has said everything's on the table, and that means entitlements.
Okay. Where do you see, how much deficit reduction are we talking about here in any one plan for any one given year? We're spending what, 1.2 trillion more than we're taking in right now. Do you expect to get that down to zero, to 400 billion? What are we talking
Well,
here?
I think over a 10-year period, our proposal looked at about a $6 trillion reduction. The president's looked at about a 4, but raised taxes by 2. So really it was about a $2 trillion reduction in spending. So we're still quite far apart, and that's where they're trying to find some common ground in these meetings.
Okay. And we hope to have something, like you said, done by July.
I think mid-July is getting to be sort of the end of the time, because if you get too close to that August 2nd date, I think you risk people being concerned whether Congress is actually going to do something or not, and do something of value.
Do you see the markets reacting before even Moody's or anybody else, such as the three rating agencies? Do you see the market reacting really much more quickly?
Well, I'm not an expert on the market, but they could. And what you don't want to do is really get into an area that no one, even the experts, really can predict, to the day. You can get sort of an idea, and I know, as they've described, as we get somewhat close to that date, they get more worried about whether there'll be some market, effect as a result of that. So you don't even want to get into that area, because then your decisions are based on what's happening in the market. You want really to make long-term decisions that hopefully we can do before that happens.
Okay. Let's talk before, I want to get in the trade agreements here in a minute, but I want to talk about Dodd-Frank first before we leave this area here. My understanding is that they've been, they're with the regulators, but there's a lot of concern out there, particularly among derivatives markets. I understand that they're doing too much, trying to do too much, and it's just going to cost just tons more for businesses to operate. Am I right there? Is that?
Well, you are. I mean, both Dodd-Frank and the healthcare bill unloaded tremendous discretion onto the agencies. And so the bills really are kind of a shell, and the real legislating is being done at the agencies. Now, it's harder for the public to impact that. It's less transparent. It's harder for people to find out what's going on. These regulations that are coming out are actually viewed as making it harder for lenders to give individuals and businesses the kind of money they need to grow and invest. And that's a problem. So I think there's been an overreach both with Dodd-Frank, and I think that's making it harder for our economy to recover, because businesses can't grow and expand without capital. And if capital is actually too hard to get, now obviously there were abuses and they needed to be addressed, but I think this has gone too far.
What is Congress's role now that you've passed the legislation? What if you don't like the way the rules are being written? What can Congress do? Is it something really difficult to do?
It is, because you have to go through another piece of legislation to legislatively change a rule, and it's as you know, it's very hard to get bills through the Congress. So again, you've dug yourself in a hole and you're trying to dig out of it.
And would you have to do that on every separate regulation?
Every separate regulation you'd want to change, you'd have to go after it. We're also struggling with this whole ability to regulate greenhouse gases, and we've passed in the House at least saying, EPA does not have the authority to do that. The other thing is to challenge these regulations in court, and that takes years and years to get resolved.
Okay. Let's move on to the trade agreements. You've said in the past that we need to get these done. Why aren't we getting them done?
Well, they've pended for 5 years, and we really need to show some, and it's up to the president to send them to the Hill. He needs to step forward and say, I need to send these up, and then the Congress can begin working on them. We need to mark them up, and then they're voted on, and then the president has to enter them into force and sign them. But I think it's very important we begin to engage. We know we're in a global economy. We know we're competing with the European Union, with the Canadians, with all over the world with countries. And if we continue to not address these, the European Union has 46 pending trade agreements. We have 3. They're far ahead of us. And if they establish these markets before we do, they will have those markets for years to come, and it'll be harder for us to break into those markets than to establish them. In some cases, it's about keeping and expanding the markets we have. Colombia is the largest country in South America for our agricultural exports. It's so important to this region and to Michigan. And we're beginning to lose those to not just the Europeans and the Canadians, but to the Argentinians as well. So that we have a lot to do. The world is looking for us to lead here. We need to grow our exports. The Independent International Trade Commission says that if we pass these 3 trade agreements, it's 250,000 jobs in the U.S. net jobs. So it'll be a plus for our economy. This is a time when we need that employment, and now's the time to move on them.
Okay. Are the agreements contingent upon one another?
No, they're separate.
So theoretically, we could pass South Korea without passing the two in South America?
The other 2, yes. In theory, you could do that.
Okay. Does the holdup seem to be something that's in the language of the bills, or?
Well, I think with Korea, the worry was about protecting market share for U.S. companies. I think that's been resolved. It was resolved last December. Mm-hmm. For Colombia, are they really strong enough on labor rights? Is it possible to collectively bargain? I think they've addressed those issues. They entered into a separate labor agreement. Their final installment on this separate labor agreement is to be filed June 15th. So I believe the Colombians are right at the door of being ready to be voted on. And Panama's been done for some time now.
Okay. Do you see the passage of these as affecting at all the presidential race in 2012?
I don't. I think this is something that has been ready to go a long time ago. We needed the sort of presidential push to get it done. We still need that. I think obviously the president has said positive things about trade in these agreements, but we need them to be passed through the House and Senate.
Okay. What do you see as the biggest talking points, you might say, between now and 2012?
I think it's going to be the economy and jobs. I think it's the 2012 election. I think ultimately is going to be where are we in terms of that. We haven't seen the recovery like we'd like to see. I think obviously the president is responsible for that. His very vaunted stimulus plan has not created the jobs that they projected. So I think that's the issue for 2012.
Are the jobs not being created because business isn't spending the money to do the outlay that they need to do to hype up, to ramp up the job market, because there's a lot of uncertainty there, or is it because of any type of policies that are out there that you'd like to see changed?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think one, there is uncertainty about what the regulations are going to mean in the future. We kind of know some that have come out, but where are they going to go? So there's a sense of holding back, waiting to see what happens. I think that's the biggest thing. The other thing is these other policy changes. The uncertainty in our tax code. A big chunk of it expires at the end of 2012. A big chunk expires at the end of this year. They need to know what are their costs going to be. The uncertainty over the health care bill. What sorts of requirements are going to be placed on business by the regulatory part of this bill. So they're really being careful before they make a major investment in building a plant, hiring people. All those things come into play. So I think it's a combination of factors.
Okay. We got less than a minute to go. I got one more question.
Yeah.
You do have a presidential race coming up. The Republican field is kind of waffling now. Whose horse are you on?
Well, I haven't endorsed anybody yet, but I'm obviously looking very carefully at it. I think it's actually good to have a big field. All these candidates are going to really get experience on the stump, and they're going to need that because it's not easy to challenge an incumbent. So I'm watching. Maybe this summer I'll make a decision, but I haven't done that yet.
Okay, so a lot of things are going to be coming up this summer by the looks of things. My guest today has been Dave Camp, representative from our area in Congress, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Ralph.
It's been a pleasure again. This is Ralph Wirtz, managing editor of the Midland Daily News. This has been another edition of Front Page, a cooperative effort between the Midland Daily News and Midland Community Television. We'll see you next time.